This is a tutorial about the cleanup process you'll want to go through before you submit your work. Here we have two different objects in Maya, and I'm going to systematically go down all the systems necessary to make sure that the objects are correctly sized, that they have the correct shaders, they're named correctly, and that ultimately there is no history within the Maya project. So the first thing you want to do is to bring up not just your visuals, because if we just look at the 3D modeling window, we have this kind of evil Pikachu head with a couple of holes missing, and we don't see any other objects. So the assumption is we have just one object. However, when you bring up the outliner, which is something you definitely need to work with, you can notice that there are not just one, not two, but actually three different objects. One is visible off here on the right, and the other one is actually invisible. And these are intentional because these are different fairly common mistakes that students can make. So the first thing is you want to make sure that everything is visible. And you can only do that by having the outliner up, because that's the only way to make absolutely positive that you have access to each of the objects. Click on anything that's invisible. Here in the channel editor, you should see the visibility channel and be able to change that from off to on. And we can see here that Pikachu's evil brother is in gray. We don't actually need that model, so I'm merely going to press delete, which gets rid of it. These other objects should be combined. Remember, you can only submit one object. But the first thing I want to do is to make sure that everything is sized correctly. To do that, you go down here to the preferences, and you can bring up one of two different menu selections to bring up the preferences. The first one is the animation preferences are this little red running man icon that you can click on. It should bring up preferences. The other way is, of course, if you go up to Window and go down to Settings, Preferences, and then go down to the submenu, first selection at the top, Preferences. You'll get the same thing. So in this case, we want to click down here on the leftmost column to Settings and make sure that everything is in feet. I prefer feet. And I also like 30 frames per second. I know 90% of the models that are going to be submitted are not animation models, but I like to make things as consistent as possible. So I like to put on 30 frames per second. But it's essential to have either foot or, if you must, meters, depending upon the information you have in the blueprints you may possibly be using. So this is the first of two steps to make sure that the world is consistent. You go into the preferences, under settings, make sure that you have either foot or meters and 30 frames per second, and press save. The second part of this is that you want to make sure that the grid, this gray grid, reflects a finite square on which you can build. You also want to make sure that each of these little tiny gray squares has some relevance to the settings you've just made. So come up here to Display, go down to the first selection, Grid, and go to the options for it. This will bring up the options for how you see the grid within your project. And sometimes Maya goes crazy and puts in some insane numbers. I like to keep it down to length and width 10 units, meaning you're only going to see a matrix of 10 by 10 gray squares on each of these four quadrants. Grid lines every single unit, and subdivisions 1. It really simplifies the visual representation of the feet or meters you set up earlier. So now we can see that each one of these lines is corresponding to this, the settings, it is going to be 1 foot. So that allows me the chance to say, well, this thing is really way too large. I need to scale it down quite a lot. And so I do, and because I'm not really working from any blueprints, it doesn't matter. I'm sort of arbitrarily scaling these things, but I do want to get them down to something like a reasonable level so that we can be building the evil Pikachu head, which is only about, let's say, 5 meters by 5 meters or something like that. So when I've got them down to something that is a little more reasonable, I can go into one of the options on the side to make sure it's floating over the grid. You may want to go and make sure that your grid is visible. in these submenus. Sorry, this is actually off the recording screen, but if you click on Show, you see that you have selections for NURBS, curves, and all these things. Off the recording screen, fourth from the bottom is the word Grid, and I've simply made sure that that is on. So we now have the grid, and we can see that it is displayed. And if you still don't see the grid, chances are it's because the camera you're using, in this case, the side camera, you can barely see the word side down here, and I've grabbed the corresponding camera here in the outliner, needs to be pulled back a bit. Remember that the translation of it is kind of irrelevant if you're dealing in one axis, the x-axis, because the further back you pull it, in this case I'm going from 328 to 1000, I can actually pull the camera so far back you can't see your object anymore. So I'm going to make sure that if I grab the camera under View, Select Camera, and then click again to Camera Attributes, I can swing down to make sure that the near and far clipping plane are a little more reasonable. Now in this case, this is just too short. I want to bring it into something like 10,000. The camera can handle that distance. So what I've asked the camera to do is to say, please draw objects within what looks like 100,000 is the far clipping plane, 100,000 units, and 0.003 is the near clipping plane. And as you can see, these suddenly pop into view. So those of you that are having a problem seeing the grid in certain views and or seeing the object, you can see the clipping plane is actually shearing off what the computer draws. And if you were to grab this camera as well, grab selection and increase that far clipping plane of what it draws, then you'll get the whole of the object. And if the near clipping plane, it's not working, you may have to actually grab the camera and make sure that the camera is pulled back far enough away from this object that it can see what it needs to, and it's not too near the camera, or the camera's not interpenetrating the object with proximity. So I've dragged it back to about 10,000 units here. So now we're seeing the object. We're a little more cognizant of what it looks like. And I'm going to go into the second step, which is you want to make sure that these, when they're sized correctly, and let's say that in this case I'm creating a hat for the evil Pikachu. This is my very carefully crafted evil Pikachu head. There we go. Now it's ready to combine. And so if I come in here and I combine these things under the polygons menu in Maya and click on mesh, go down to combine. You might want to check the options for it, make sure that I frankly like to reset things because the default settings for a lot of the tools in Maya is really all you need. And I can click on apply. Well, now we have, of course, history in here, but that's frankly okay because we've got a number of things to take care of. First of all, we need to make sure that everything is frozen at the proper size. So you can reset the transformations, apply. Okay, it's frozen, kind of an overkill really, because the minute that you combine two objects, it actually is default 000 translate, rotate, and scale 111. But if you were to go back to your original objects, and I'll just do several undo steps here, you would need to come up here if you were going to export separate objects, or let's say that only one of these objects existed. You want to make sure that they are frozen. So freeze transformations, go into the options, make sure translate, rotate, and scale are all clicked, and you can press apply, and now everything is evened out. That's great. And if you combine several objects, two or more, the resulting object is of course going to be scaled by default as well. So now we have an object that is scaled properly, that is combined. It is in the world using a particular range of units, feet, and we need to then go into the shaders and make sure that this whole mess of shaders here is nothing that we export with all kinds of useless information in it that's not being used. It's a result of some leftover operation from earlier, that this does not get saved in with the Maya export. So what you want to do is you want to come over here to File, Optimize Scene Size, click on the options for it. I like, frankly, to click on all the options for Optimize Scene, because once you optimize the scene, it should get rid of not just the shaders that are not being used, it should also get rid occasionally of some modeling things that are not being used, such as were you to draw curves, etc. It does not tend to get rid of actual geometry. Your meshes are not in are not in a firing line in this. So with one object combined, of course, I want to give it one shader. Now, the shaders are also things you need to not only be aware that you've cleaned them up and optimized them, but that you've named them correctly. So in this case, if I'm going to submit Evil Pikachu head, I want to give it a shader that actually has the word Evil Pikachu shader. Usually the naming convention is one of genus, species, phylum, but it really is up to you. As long as you then can take this same name, and I'm going to use the old trick of, in this shader selected, double click the name, then Control C for copy, and then I can come over here to the outliner and actually Control V paste, replacing the word shader with the word mesh. Now I've got a mesh and a shader that correspond, and one of the last things I want to do is make sure that everything's got that shader, because there's two different shaders. If you notice, there's the red one, which is this down here, and then there's the blue one. Also at this point, you want to make very sure you are not using Lambert 1, which is the default shader in Maya. You never want to apply that. You never want to change it. Make sure that if you're using it, you create another shader, copy everything you need to that, and use that shader on your object. Leave Lambert 1 alone. How can you tell Lambert 1 is the thing you cannot utilize? It's fairly easy. You're not actually able to rename it. So if you're not able to rename your shader, you know that that's a danger sign. And that's why we want to make sure that we rename not just the shaders, but also the meshes. So this last step is one where you come up here and you want to delete all by type. You want to delete all history. And when you delete all the history, anything that is a leftover remnant ghost of the operation of combining things, or in some cases you've got a whole laundry list of history on an individual object here, all of that gets cleaned up. So I'm going to do one last operation, which is that I make sure that this object uses only one shader, assign that material to the selection, and I'm going to do one last pass with deleting all by type history, and I'm going to do one last pass with optimize scene size. Why? I no longer need this red shader. So that should get rid of the red shader, which it does. I have Lambert 1, I have Evil Pikachu shader, I have Evil Pikachu mesh, and now I'm ready to export. Remember, of course, to try and save your scene first before you actually export in case, God forbid, something happens. But that should help you out to make sure that your scenes are clean enough so that anybody that uses them can have a simple, ready-to-use mesh without any of the noise of history or any of the complications that come from too much data when you're trying to export this into FBX or some other format.